obviously, we are very interested in your book and the background, which is my favorite book ever. So how did you do your research? Because so we have Robert Boyle, we have Richard Lower, Charles II, then Peter Stahl, Wren.
Well, the research, of course, was done. I've written a long time ago. It seems almost prehistoric now, but of course it was before the internet had been invented. And so you had to go into the library, and I just spent sort of about 2 years trotting into the library every morning and reading and just getting random books out. But the great virtue of going into the library and doing it like that is you come across stuff that you would never have thought of. Whereas if you use the internet, you merely tend to read what's on it and you only ever look at what you've been looking for. You don't have many sort of random discoveries.
What were your biggest discoveries of the period, which really surprised you? So we have to go back, 1640 or even before.
It was getting into this and getting this sort of sense of how much fun they were having, and also what they were doing there. I mean, the thing which I didn't realise, of course, is that all these people, the Oxford Scientific Revolution, all that, was, and these were a bunch of unemployable graduate students. And they were in Oxford doing all this stuff because they couldn't get a job. Most of them were royalists. Most of them were Anglicans. Some were and they were unemployable. I mean, they were persona non grata. Normally, they would have, done their thing in Oxford. Then they would have drifted off into a nice position in the church, and working for the government, or becoming a doctor or a lawyer. But all of a sudden, because of the Civil War, they couldn't do that. Their patronage networks from their families had been destroyed. The jobs had dried up. The church was no longer there. So they were stuck. And they were just sort of twiddling their thumbs, waiting for times to change. And so they just sort of did this stuff, But when Charles II came back, very quickly they all began to drift off. Someone like Lower, went down to London and didn't really do any research again. Locke gave up medicine and became, what he became. But Wren became an architect and a pretty much crown bureaucrat and did no more maths. So when normality returned, this group broke up, and that period of scientific endeavour was over. I mean, they founded the Royal Society, but by that stage, of course, they were getting on. They were no longer graduate students. They were sort of members of the establishment. They were becoming middle-aged and a bit boring. And the Oxford period was this loose thing which was powered by ideas and friendship, and which I didn't really understand at all until I read quite a lot about it. And Willis, he was a sort of leader of that because he was older. I mean, he was born in 1621, right? Whereas most of the others were born in the late 20s, early 30s. So he was about 10 years older. And so he was able to give a certain direction and assistance because of his age and experience. Whereas, what's his name? Wilkins, the Warden of Wadham, had a sort of institutional base which could assist. And Boyle could help out because he was stinking rich. But apart from that, it was just a group of people who knew each other, generally liked each other, not always, who helped each other, assisted each other, and formed this little network of shared endeavour and also shared misery and anxiety. And so writing about that was, I think, interesting. And it's not something, I think, which has been greatly appreciated or understood before.
But the Civil War, in a way, contributed to this, as you call it, this intellectual fermentation.
It was an extraordinary period, which, because I always, all these wretched Puritans and being tiresome, I never really appreciated them because they always seemed no fun. But again, sort of reading about it, what was going on, I mean, you got first, this was the period where you got the first and the whole of Europe, the first secular political party. You've got the birth of a form of socialism, of feminism. You've got all the incredible ideas in religion and in science. Everything which has fueled English or British history ever since was sort of brought up and discussed and talked about in this period, which makes it extraordinarily exciting, because they knew that they were just talking about sort of dangerous stuff or interesting stuff or new stuff. They didn't know what to do with it. And that's clear in medicine as well, because, you know, they were trying to get away from this old medicine, but they couldn't find the language not to use it. So they were trying to meld these new experimental methods and new techniques and understandings with the old methods of doing it, and the contortions and the difficulties that they had was, again, thrilling to read about. The trouble was, it often made it incomprehensible. I mean, I don't know if you've ever read your way through any Boyle, but my God, I mean, talk about never using a sentence when an entire chapter will do. I mean, he just goes on and on and on, trying to get his thoughts in order, and often managing it, but it's such an effort to understand what on earth he's talking about.
Did you read anything about the originals of Anthony Wood?
Oh yeah, I mean, Anthony Wood is, you know, one of the major characters in the thing, and the whole book is really based on his diaries, the thing that he published, because I mean, he says, you know, day by day, you know, he sort of amongst these people, he talks about, you know, eating in taverns and who he was eating with and what they ate, and you can then match that up to various sorts of letters and figure out day by day what was going on and who was doing what and who was seeing who and who was talking to whom about what. And this, so that was the basis. I mean, I really liked Wood. Nobody else ever has. I mean, he seems to have been a bit of a miserable business.
He never had a good word of anybody.
No, he wasn't like, I mean, he had a lot to be grouchy about, I suppose. I mean, he was all constantly running out of money, and no one ever recognised him. And he was, you know, he was very much an original of one of these often sort of rather sad people you see around Oxford, going from sort of thing to thing and never really finding a place for themselves, but never being able to leave either. Bit like me, really. And so he was, so I got rather fond of him. I sort of understood him, you know. But he was just an extraordinary fountain of knowledge, because he just wrote everything down.
How about Christopher Wren?
Wren has a walk-on role. I mean, I have a sort of, you know, a few cameos and bring people in. So, I mean, Wren has a sort of walk-on role. Wren, I've never really... I found something cold about Wren. He's a bit of an operator, Wren. In some ways, he was too far ahead of the others. You know? And there's something about it that seemed rather sort of confident, and that's not like the other ones.
I know quite little about John Thurlow, and yeah. I think there are two, no? The father and the son.
Well, I only had one. I mean, the John Thurlow was the Cromwell spymaster. His Secretary of State. It was an interesting character because he survived. I mean, and an awful lot is known about him, because he was one of these people who managed to, a bit like quite a lot of them. I mean, they managed to sort of slide from one regime to another without ever coming to harm. And the Thurlow, you would have thought, would have been taken out and hanged, but in fact, he was the classic man who knew where the bodies were buried, and so nobody could touch him. But he took all his safety relied on his papers, which said, you know, what everybody's done. And in order to keep them safe, he plastered them into the walls and ceiling of his rooms in the Inns of Court, where they stayed after he died for about the next 100 years. And then someone was renovating the room and found these things. And so that's why we know an awful lot about this period that we didn't before, and why Thurlow survived. And his papers are wonderful. because they talk about all these plots and how the Cromwell's government ran and what it was up to, which so the period is much better known than it might otherwise have been.
You also had a character, Peter Stahl, who was a German chemist who brought to Oxford by Boyle.
Yeah.
In 1659. So how did you get information about...
Oh, that just comes from Wood. I mean, not much. I mean, a little bit is known about Stahl, but not much. But there's just this passage in Wood's diaries about meeting Peter Stahl, a notorious hater of women, as he describes him, and how very good he was at chemical experiments and how Boyle relied on him. He ran experiments for Boyle. But, you know, that's all. I mean, all his character and everything like that, which is in the book, I just made up. There's no historical truth to it at all, except this one passage in Wood, which describes him as being exceptionally ingenious, but also quite unpleasant. So,
when you read all these recipes for the therapies, what were your thoughts?
Well, again, I mean, the recipes for all the various medicines was this jumble of the old and the new. You know, they would do experiments and trying to find stuff that works, and there was this whole tradition of going back to the classical period of what worked and why it worked, and there was humours and there was astrology and all this stuff jumbled together. And they were trying to sort it through, and they couldn't get rid of anything because they had no reason. They couldn't prove that this stuff didn't work. They couldn't yet replace it with anything better. They just had this strong suspicion that something was wrong somewhere, and they were trying to figure a way through it. So they would, you know, all doctors would quite cheerfully try and prescribe what are called chemical medicines. And do stuff like consult the stars as well, and found no contradiction in that. And it's the fact that they couldn't find that they were both methods, both approaches, they could use simultaneously.
So Richard Lower was doing some transfusion.
The transfusion, the whole business of transfusion was interesting because, you know, they started doing it for all the wrong reasons. And they came up with this reasoning about how, you know, the life force is in the blood. So if you stick someone's healthy life force into someone who's sick, that will be great.
But they did xeno transfusion as well.
Yeah. And then they said, well, you know, if that's the case, and something that's really strong, you know, like a bull, if you put bull's blood into people, you know, elixir of life. And so the reasoning was entirely wrong, but at least a few times when they did it, it worked. And it worked because they used the relatives of the people that they transfused blood into. So the blood type was the same. And so it was just fine. But then it started going wrong. And they realized that they didn't know why it was going wrong. It shouldn't be going wrong. The reasoning was fine, but it started going wrong. And so everybody stopped it, and they didn't restart it again until the beginning of the 20th century, I think.
In France, it was prohibited.
Yeah. And because until they figured out blood types. But this was a fine example of a potentially major step forward, taken for all, arrived at through completely erroneous reasoning, and which didn't then lead into any real reassessment of the reasoning for a very, very long time. They just stopped thinking about it. But it's an example of how scientific advance isn't always an advance. You always tend to see it as off with the old, on with the new, you know, a revolution casting out all this old knowledge and new dawn. But of course, it wasn't like that. I mean, it grew, the new ways of thinking just grew inside the old ways of thinking. And similarly, there was no problem between science and religion. That was a sort of 19th century invention. I mean, Boyle's whole program was to try and find a way of reconciling the world with the Bible, and it never occurred to him that there could ever be any contradiction. And if there was a contradiction, then that meant that his experiments hadn't been done properly, so he'd have to try harder. And this idea that God gave man 2 books of revelation, one was nature, the other was the Bible. They could not contradict each other. And so a lot of the impetus behind this scientific revolution was religious. It came out of religion. And without that religion, probably without the religious turmoil of the time, it might not have happened, or certainly couldn't have happened in that way.
When you walk around Oxford, which sites do you start thinking about Willis?
Well, very few. I mean, the only one, he lived in Merton Street.
Do you know whether he lived in number 3 or number 4? Because I know that the blue plaque is up number 4, but Alistair Compton told me that it might have been number 3, and he might have worked in number 4.
Yeah, but it was somewhere in Merton Street, and he was sort of next door but one to Anthony Wood, which, they probably borrowed milk off each other and cups of sugar.
So at Beam Hall, at Merton Street at Beam Hall, when Willis was active, this was their office, or do you think they lived? Of course, Willis lived next door, but do you think the others lived on site, or they were just using it as an office?
A lot of the stuff that they did didn't require much space. It's not such a thing you laboratories or anything like that. You could do, if you could do an autopsy in someone's kitchen, then you could run a fairly major chemical experiment and dissect things in at home without any need for much in the way of special locations. They just did it when they could. It's very, very simple. Because they would do whatever needed. I know that most autopsies from hangings was done in the upper reading room of the Bodleian. But if you could manage to get hold of your own corpse, you'd do it at home. They're doing some work and outside the Bodleian, and they came across these huge number of bones. It was the people who'd been dissected after being hanged. They'd be taken off the upper reading room and chopped to pieces, and then they'd just be stuck in the garden.
At some point, some of the dissection moved to the basement of the building where the History of Science Museum is.
Yes, well, that would have been a much better place for it.
And then later on, they had a building at Christchurch where they have the fellows' lunching facility now. Then this is where the dissection moved. And it wasn't until 1893 when we had the anatomy building. One question I never understood is that at least for a short period, you had William Harvey as the neighbor of Willis. Mm-hmm. For 1 year he was warden of Merton. He wasn't liked very much, but he was working on the heart, and he had incredible contributions. So do you think they had any interaction between the...
They must have done. Oxford was tiny. It was absolutely tiny. It was like a large village. Even at the best of times, it probably had a population of maybe 10, 12,000. In the Civil War period, that shrank. You couldn't not know everybody. And anybody in the same line of business with the same interests, research, certainly had to know each other very, very well. That was, whether they liked each other, of course, but even if they didn't like each other, they was a sort of, they would stick together against the outside world. And they would defend each other, and continue to do that right the way through. When Willis, I think, was in the late 1660s, was attacked for his stuff on blood and urine or something like that, and Lower, who would seem pretty much given up research, instantly settled down and penned an answer, a defence, and they looked after each other even when they disagreed. Simply because, they had too much in common not to. But they certainly they could not have known each other. They had such a good time, and it's. You might, be able to remember back to your own youth, you know, that period where you're completely irresponsible, where everything is new, everything's exciting. You have total, in their case, they had total freedom to do whatever they wanted because they couldn't get a job, because they couldn't be respectable and responsible. They might as well be irresponsible and do all this stuff. And so they had this life, which was really very much a sort of graduate student life, that they would work, they would talk, they would go drinking, and just had fun. They didn't have families, they didn't have children, they didn't have jobs, they didn't have responsibilities. They were just having a really good time. And then, you know, they grew up and got all of those things and became, you know, much less interesting. But, you know, for that period from early 1650s to about 1663, 64, when they began to go down to London, I think they had a wonderful time. Lucky them.
Thank you very much, Iain. We really appreciate your help.